I'm going to start out with Dr. Michel and Dr. Rouget. In 1981, former Federal Reserve Chairman Volcker testified before the Senate Banking Committee at a time of growing deficits and elevated inflation. As part of his testimony, he called on Congress to cut spending while also pursuing pro-growth policies. With respect to taxes, he urged Congress to focus on reforms that would incentivize Americans, in his words, to invest, to save, and to work. Are the prescriptions laid out by Chairman Volcker in 1981 good guiding principles for Congress today?
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Well, it looks like Chairman Volcker understood that there's actually a connection between the monetary side and the fiscal side while fighting inflation, and that the Federal Reserve can't do it alone. And it seemed that his prescriptions are really important, because one of the things that happens when the Federal Reserve raises interest rate is that it actually makes interest payment more expensive, increase the need for borrowing, hence fueling inflation, but also increasing growth by freeing the supply side is also a way to actually help fight inflation. So it seems that, yes, they are really good prescription. And unfortunately, I'm worried that actually the fact that there's no talk about austerity right now, however you want to define it, means it's fueling inflation. It's making the job of the Fed even harder. I'm worried that the increase of tariffs is actually constraining the supply side. There's just a lot of things happening that actually make it much harder for the Federal Reserve to really lower inflation to target.
Dr. Michel?
I'll add that with debt at 100% of GDP or higher, trending towards $2 trillion deficits, a $400 billion a year tax increase hanging over Americans' heads at the end of 2025 when the 2017 tax cuts expire. All of this depresses economic activity. Businesses and individuals have to plan for the future. And if they know that they're going to have to be sending more money to Washington, they're going to do less of all of the productive activities that grow the economy, expand the supply side, make it easier to fight inflation. And so those sort of fiscal threats that are hanging out in the future are certainly making things harder, and something that was certainly understood at the time by Chairman Volcker.
Also, Dr. Michel, your testimony discusses how our current tax code disincentives savings and recommends policies to counteract that bias. Last Congress, I introduced a Middle Class Savings and Investment Act that would effectively exempt the middle class from tax on most of their savings and investment income. It would do this by aligning the current zero tax rate bracket for capital gains and dividends with a 22% income tax bracket and excluding a modest amount of interest income from tax. Do you agree that the proposal along these lines could significantly reduce the current tax code bias against savings? And I'm not asking you to endorse the bill, just the philosophy.
Yeah, well, thank you for your leadership on this issue, and certainly the additional layers of taxes through capital gains, on dividends, on interest, all decrease savings. And to the extent that we can expand the number of Americans that don't get hit by these taxes, and simplifying them by aligning brackets as your bill does, all of that pushes in the direction of giving more Americans greater opportunity to save and invest their own income. So certainly a great way of encouraging investment, and we should continue to push in expanding these types of policies.
Dr. Rouget, many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claim our mounting debt and deficit can be solved solely by taxing the wealthy. Isn't it true that absent spending reductions, tax hikes for middle-class Americans will become inevitable?
Yes, the answer is yes. And the reason, there are two. First, there's not enough tax revenue that can actually address our debt problem. right? That's the first thing. Plus, raising taxes to the level that would require, would be very detrimental to growth, which hence would then backfire. But there's also a really big economic literature about the best way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio. It's been conducted in like 180 different countries, looking at what they've done to succeed and what they have done when they didn't succeed. And what that literature finds is that the best way to reduce the debt to GDP ratio is to enact fiscal adjustments that are mostly based on spending cuts, preferably transfer, social spending, like, so that's entitlement in the American context. The bad news from this literature is that actually, in spite of the fact that we know what we should do, a lot of the time, legislators choose to implement packages that are mostly made of taxes, and hence they fail.